Welcome to Oiko. I'm your host, Gina Ranieri, for KZSC Santa Cruz 88.1 FM. Today, we're talking about food. Think about what's on your plate. What kind of fruits and vegetables do you have? Think of all those strawberries, lettuce, broccoli, tomatoes that make up so much of our diet. Where did it come from? If you are listening here on the Central Coast, the answer is probably here. California produces a third of the nation's vegetables and 2/3 of its fruits and nuts, grown mostly in Salinas and Central Valleys. However, most of the produce we grow here is shipped out to other parts of the country, while local supermarkets import from far-off places. Just this morning, I found out the avocados in my refrigerator were from Mexico, bananas were from South America, and my honey is from Canada. Sending all this produce all around the world, in addition to conventional farming practices, creates a huge carbon footprint. Food production accounts for 21% of all greenhouse gas emissions, especially transportation. In light of climate change, we can all benefit from minimizing our own carbon footprint as best we can. Our plates are an excellent way to start. For a closer look at our local farms, I went to the Santa Cruz Farmers Market and talked to the farmers themselves.
Yeah, I'm Ronald Donkenvoort and I am Windmill Farm.
You are Windmill Farm. What do you grow?
I grow all the local coastal vegetables, all the greens, and then we do winter squash and strawberries.
Your strawberries look really nice. How's the crop this year?
Thank you. So far so good, a little late start with the late rains, but yeah, it's all good, yeah, fine.
Has any the inclement weather been a problem?
No, not really, because even though you get a lot of rain this winter, it stops raining kind of when it's supposed to. So It would be a problem if it would rain now with all the berries being there. But it's all good.
You're an organic farm, right?
Last 32 years, yeah.
Yes. What does that mean? What do you do?
That means we don't use any chemicals and we do all the weeding by hand. And we do crop rotation and we cover crop the field. And being also organic, I think also part of that is that we only sell food locally. So we don't go on the highway with trucks and transport the food. So we grow locally, sell locally. And
how big is your farm?
We do 8 acres.
8 acres.
Oh.
And how much crop is that?
Well, we grow all year round. So
Okay,
we're always
cool.
planting. We're planting every 2 or 3 weeks. And we do 12 months out of the year. We come to the markets. We do 3 markets a week.
How many other organic farmers are there, do you think, in Santa Cruz?
More and more.
Okay, more and more.
When I
That's
started 32 years ago, it wasn't so many yet. But now I lost track, which is a good thing.
good. Over the years, has anything changed?
Well, when I started, there was no markets, but Cabrillo Market and Felton Market. So there was a lot more markets, and it's due to the higher demand, of course. It goes hand in hand. And it became a lot more mainstream from when I started.
For a little more on sustainable animal agriculture, here's Rebecca King, a sheep farmer.
Rebecca King, garden variety cheese and Monkey Flower Ranch.
Okay, so what kind of products do you make?
We are a sheep dairy and make cheese and yogurt, and then we also raise lamb and pork meat and chickens for eggs.
Is it all organic?
We're not certified organic. We were for a few years before the drought, and then the price of hay got just too expensive. So the only thing that's changed in our practices is we get conventionally grown hay, alfalfa hay that's non-GMO, but it's all organic grain. We don't use hormones or chemical wormers or pesticides or antibiotics.
How big is your operation?
40 acres, and we have about 100 sheep that we milk, and about, at any given time, about 30 pigs, and about 300 chickens.
Does this have a smaller carbon footprint than cow's milk or cow farming?
Well, it's not just sheep versus cow, it's also the type of farm operation. We're the grain that we use is all spent grain from Santa Cruz Mountain Brewing, which is a waste product for them. And we're buying a little bit of Modesto milling grain, but primarily it's all recycling a waste product. And because we're small scale and we're just selling locally, our food isn't traveling really long distances. You know, the furthest is maybe 150 miles from where it's produced. And then we've participated in the CDFA, the California State Healthy Soils Initiative that came out last year, I guess was the first year. It's a grant program for farmers to incorporate different practices on their farms that help reduce carbon emissions. We've put in hedgerows and been adding compost to our soils, which is great for us because it improves the pasture and then it also locks more carbon into the soil.
What other steps have you taken to reduce your carbon footprint?
Well, we have solar power that offsets most of the electricity use of the dairy. Like I said, we we mostly sell and source locally, so we're not traveling long distances.
Has your business changed at all in recent years?
Oh yeah, it's constantly changing. Just trying to stay in business as a small business, you have to be really creative and adaptive. And things like having a drought really puts a lot of pressure. You know, like we had to give up being certified organic because of the drought and try and find ways to deal with the added costs and pressures from that.
What do you recommend for people that are trying to eat more locally?
Well, shopping at the farmers market is by far the best place to start. More of your dollar is going straight to the farmer when you buy at the farmers market. Things are going to be much more fresh, usually harvested that day. And the vendors often have a lot of knowledge about the food because that's what they're eating when they go home, so they can give you tips on preparing food, and most of it's coming from closer than what you would get at the grocery store too.
What's your favorite recipe using your cheeses?
That's a tough one. Probably sheep milk cheesecake because sheep cheese is particularly rich and tangy.
That sounds delicious.
It makes a really killer cheesecake. We just, instead of sour cream, we use yogurt, and instead of the cream cheese, we use our sweet lessen, which is like a fromage blanc style cheese.
Oh, that sounds delicious. For all this talk about growing food, we're leaving out an important player, pollinators, especially honeybees. Local honey can actually help with allergies and strengthen your immune system. The pollen that makes your nose run and eyes water is the same pollen that local bees use for honey, and ingesting it can enhance your natural immunity. Anthony Tomaso, a beekeeper, can tell us more.
Anthony Tomaso, Aptos apiary.
How many hives do you have?
But it fluctuates between 30 and 50.
And what's the reason for the fluctuation?
Still learning how to be a good beekeeper, and you get a certain amount of die-off. This year was a really hard year.
Have a lot of the colonies collapsed?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't know what I'd call it collapse. They just gradually die, or they, if it's not the queen, then it's the food source. And
where do your bees go to find the flowers?
all around. They just go all around.
Just go all around?
Yeah, within a couple of miles is kind of optimum.
Okay.
But they will fly farther.
Yeah. I've read how some apiarists will take their bees to pollinate other crops and just bring the hive over, let them pollinate, and bring them back. Do you do something like that?
No, I just kind of go for stationary places. Like I have a place in Big Sur and a place in Santa Cruz and a place in Aptos. And that way stationary so I don't have to move so much.
Yeah, what's special about those places?
Well, the flowers, and usually I try to go around a water source.
Okay, is there like any specific flowers that make better tasting honey?
Well, we get eucalyptus well here, and then sage and toyon, and there's just a whole bunch of them. Central California is pretty nice, pretty abundant place.
Do you know why local honey would be better than store-bought, mass-produced honey? other than supporting our local farmers?
Well, right. As I said, Central California is a good place, and it takes 10,000 flowers per teaspoon of honey. So you get a tremendous immunization factor with that. Okay.
Can you explain that immunization factor a bit?
Well, it's the nectar from 10,000 flowers for a teaspoon of honey. So,
So it's the total amount of all those 10,000 flowers you're getting exposed to.
Yeah. Yes.
That will help build your immunity.
Yes.
It'd be better to buy locally because it's the plants that are around us now.
Yes. Yeah.
As opposed to buying like Canadian honey and getting immunity to Canadian flowers.
Yeah.
Yes.
Or Hawaiian.
Or Hawaiian.
Yeah.
How long have you been beekeeping?
Oh, at least 20 years, 25 years.
And has anything changed in the past 20 years?
We all keep learning about, treating them right and maintaining your colonies, and things have changed. How have things changed? Well, they acknowledge that the environment is pretty poisonous. There's a lot of everybody likes to use Roundup and chemicals to
pesticides
to get rid of the animals and the insects, and so then that goes right into the bee thing.
Are you worried about climate change at all?
Well, as a human, then we have to adapt. That's part of farming, is adapting. That's part of beekeeping, is adapting. Like this year is a real late year. We had a lot of losses, and the next, they're just starting to build up where they usually start in January and February here. Now it's, we're getting into May, and so we adjust. Everything's going to get pushed back.
In our last segment, we leave the land lubbers behind and venture out to sea, where this crop doesn't need any land to grow on. It's seaweed. You've probably seen it dried or on sushi, but plenty of different kinds grow in the Monterey Bay. Seaweed is very nutritionally dense, high in vitamins, potassium, and iodine. It's known as a zero-input crop, meaning it doesn't need arable land, irrigation, or fertilizers. It's also fantastic for the ocean. Kelp filters particles out of the water, absorbs carbon dioxide, and here in Monterey Bay, giant kelp forests provide habitat for dozens of species of fish, seals, and otters. To talk more about the benefits of seaweed, here's Ian O'Halloran.
Ian O'Halloran.
And what's your company?
Sequoia Wild Seaweeds.
And so do you forage for these seaweeds?
I forage all locally in the Monterey Bay Sanctuary from southern Big Sur north of Santa Cruz.
Are they in the intertidal or are they deep sea?
These are all, the ones at the market here today are all intertidal, and then our kelp supplement, which our iodine source, is all from the kelp forest using Macrocystis pyrifera, the giant kelp. So that one we take a boat out and harvest all by hand. All of these seaweeds are harvested by hand, and then I dye at certain times of the year for other species.
Yeah, what's that iodine supplement you were saying?
The iodine supplement is, it's made with the giant kelp, our Macrocystis. We hand harvest it and have it freeze dried and milled into a fine powder, and then we've tested it for nutritional analysis, radiation, heavy metals, microbiology, and upon the nutritional analysis, the iodine levels are really high, which is great. So we had it all had a food scientist calculate it so we can feed humanity the right proportions. So the iodine is super important for the thyroid, and the thyroid's a little butterfly-shaped gland underneath the larynx, and it produces two very important hormones called thyroxine and triiodothyronine. And those hormones reach every cell in the body, and they control our metabolism and a bunch of metabolic functions throughout the body. It's a worldwide epidemic. Like 2 billion people worldwide are iodine deficient, and that's why they added iodine into salt. But this is a pure way to get
this is like a natural iodine without having to use salts.
Without having to use salts, and or like a synthetic iodine.
Yeah. What kind of species of seaweed do you have?
So today we have 6. We have dwarf rockweed, bladderwrack, a cat's tongue, bushy cat's tongue, nori, splendid iridescent, and I think that's it today.
Yeah, and you sell them both fresh and dried, right?
Fresh and dried, yeah. So we sun dry, dehydrate, We do nori chips, sea palm chips, and then we're working on a bunch of other products as well.
How do you prepare seaweed to eat?
So there's nothing specific you have to do. You could follow recipes if you want, like any seaweed recipe, but a lot of them are very versatile. It's a vegetable from the sea, so you can add them in your salads, your soups, your stir fries. You don't need to cook them very long. You know, at best to eat them fresh, because then you're getting like all the nutritional benefits of them without cooking them. They're all very versatile. People soak their beans and rice in it, give it flavor that way. They help with flatulence, so bladder wrack, for example, is a really good one for that, or kombu. Wakame salads, that's another one we harvest. So yeah, anything you can cook. We've made smoothies with them. We've done ice cream, tonics.
Wow. So it's a really, really versatile.
Very versatile. It's just kind of humanity wrapping their mind around the fact that it's just a vegetable from the sea that we're not used to eating.
Yeah.
But I've
only ever seen seaweed in either dried sheets or on sushi.
Yeah, exactly. So finding fresh seaweed is like a whole new thing to, especially our culture.
They don't require a lot to grow. Like you said, you forage them, but if we were to start like a kelp farm, we don't need to irrigate it, for example, right?
Right. Yeah. So the certain ones they filter the seawater, and it's grown in like a temperature system, so it's aquaculture, and it's the ones that are not attached to a substrate. Those are the ones that need to be attached to kind of create their community. The other ones can just kind of be free floating in water. So it's whether it's in aquaculture, if it's in the wild, nature is providing all the essential nutrients, and they photosynthesize like land plants do. So as long as the quality
fix carbon and filter the water.
They sequester carbon from the atmosphere. They combat ocean acidification, therefore, specifically the kelps, mostly. The intertidal seaweeds, I'm sure, contribute as well.
So it would be a really good thing to eat as climate change gets worse.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a good thing to start farming kelp in the open ocean, because it's going to combat ocean acidification by sequestering carbon from the atmosphere. You know, these are all sustainably foraged. Loosely used word now, sustainable, but it's a regenerative plant. So we just cut little bits of it, they regenerate pretty rapidly. So yeah, I think it's a great resource for a low impact, no external inputs from humanity, and they're growing on their own, like any wild food.
What's your favorite recipe using seaweed?
So we've done a lot of different ones. I love a very simple one with our dwarf rockweed is spiralized cucumbers, carrots, daikons, watermelon radish sliced on top. We blanch the seaweed for like 10 to 15 seconds, turns a beautiful bright green color, and then we make a homemade dressing using lemon juice, fresh lemon juice, toasted sesame seed oil, coconut nectar, and it's a really nice combo.
That sounds delicious.
Yeah.
Changes in the environment aren't going away, but we can make small steps to minimize our own personal carbon footprints, and eating locally is just one of them. Eating clean for the environment doesn't have to be bland, boring, or tasteless. Local produce is seasonal, so although you may not be able to get the berries and such year-round, what you do get is sweeter and riper. Cutting down on our carbon footprints is necessary, but that doesn't mean we can't live well in the face of climate change. For our second story, we're talking about how a small pathogen is wreaking havoc on the oak trees of Central California. Since the 1990s, Phytophthora ramorum, also known as sudden oak death, has killed over 1.6 million trees. It's hard to contain, and transmission from tree to tree is almost impossible to stop. Coastal woodlands from Big Sur to southern Oregon are all affected. In some places, 30% of oaks have died. Speaking with us today is expert plant pathologist Greg Gilbert of UC Santa Cruz. So we're talking about Phytophthora ramorum, or otherwise known as sudden oak death. So can you tell me what it is to start off with?
So Phytophthora ramorum is an oomycete. So it's not a fungus, it's not a bacterium, it's not a virus. It's an oomycete, which is a kind of a protist. It's actually fairly closely related to giant kelp. But they're very small, and they don't photosynthesize, and they grow through soil and plants and sometimes cause diseases. And that's what the Phytophthora ramorum is.
So what does an infected tree look like?
The Phytophthora infects a bunch of different species of trees, and it depends on which kind of tree it is. So one of the trees that it infects very commonly is bay laurel. And there it just infects the leaves and it causes some death on the tips of the leaf. It really doesn't bother the trees very much at all. But then it also infects oaks and tan oaks. And on those species it infects in the trunk, and it causes sunken lesions on the trunk where the wood is sort of softened up and discolored underneath. And then eventually the whole tree loses all of its leaves and dies.
So if it's not just limited to oak trees, and nursery plants have also been affected, particularly rhododendrons and camellias, except it doesn't kill them and it doesn't kill the bay laurels either. Why is that different?
Yeah, so that's what makes this such an interesting and difficult pathogen to control. So it grows on the bay laurel, it grows on rhododendrons and camellias and a whole bunch of other things, redwoods, all kinds of different plants. And it infects the leaves, and it might kill a little bit of tissue, but it really doesn't affect the plants very much. So they can continue to grow for a long time. And what happens in some of those species, especially the bay laurel and also with the rhododendrons, is the Phytophthora can reproduce on those leaves. When it reproduces, it makes spores called sporangia that are produced during wet weather, and then they splash off or they fall off and they can disperse sometimes through the air or through water or on soil or other kinds of ways of moving around. And then they spread to other trees that get infected that might have much more serious consequences. Like if it gets to an oak, it can kill the oak. So that it can grow on leaves of these other species without killing them, but reproducing is one of the reasons why it spreads so much and has caused so much ecological devastation.
How many oak trees have died so far?
I really have no idea, but I'm sure it's in the tens to hundreds of thousands.
Would that significantly affect the makeup of the forest?
Yes, in some places it's had major impacts on the structure of the forest. Here on the UCSC campus, one of the most common trees that we have in the forest is tan oak, which isn't a true oak, but it's in the same family, and it's very, very susceptible to sudden oak death. And even 10 years ago in some parts of campus, it was the second most common tree in the forest, and it's been dying like crazy. So it's really changing the whole structure of the forest, and it's what we want to know now is what's going to replace it. If we lose the tan oaks and they can't come back in, which other species are going to take its place?
Can the pathogen be contained?
It can be contained on the very large geographic scale. So there are quarantines in place for moving materials from one part of the state to another, or from California in infected areas to other states through the horticulture industry or things like that. There's a lot of inspections that have to take place, and you can only move plant material that is certified to not be infected. So that's an important mechanism for preventing it from spreading broadly and geographically going into other states. Containing it locally has been much harder because the sporangia can move so readily anytime it's wet and raining or something like that, or through other things moving it around. It's really hard to contain it on a local scale.
Yeah, so if the average person in Santa Cruz or Monterey County went to the local nursery to get a rhododendron, should they be worried about Phytophthora?
It's certainly worth paying attention to what's going on, but the nursery industry is very concerned about not producing and selling and spreading Phytophthora. So there are best practices in place that responsible nurseries are all following to reduce the probability of them being infected, and there's regular inspections, and so they shouldn't be selling any material that might be infected. Most nurseries are really on board with that. They certainly don't want to be spreading it, and so they're doing what they can to reduce it.
From an evolutionary standpoint, how can we predict this spread of forest pathogens?
That's a huge question. And most of the big impacts of forest pathogens that we've had over the last, say, 100, 150 years have all been from pathogens introduced from other places. So they're pathogens that have evolved in a particular forest, maybe the host trees over many, many, many generations have evolved resistance to the pathogen where it might be able to cause some disease, but it doesn't kill the plants. And then those pathogens get introduced, usually through people moving plant material into areas where there might be related species, but not ones that have experienced the pathogen before. So they don't have resistance to those pathogens, and when they find a suitable host, a host plant, they can infect it and then start to spread. So across the United States since the early 1900s, we've had the chestnut blight wipe out the, which is a fungal pathogen, wipe out the chestnut forests in the East Coast. Dutch elm disease, which wiped out urban forests of elms, currently still moving through parts of California. Pitch canker of pine in California when that was introduced later in the 1900s, and then right at the end of the 1990s, sudden oak death being introduced into California.
When the tree dies, the oak tree, when they die, they fall over and they tend to dry out. And given the sheer number of trees that have died since the pathogen was introduced, that I'm sort of assuming there's a huge buildup of all that dead wood. Could that possibly be connected to the extreme wildfires that we've been seeing over the past few years?
That's a really interesting question, and I don't really know the answer to it. One of the things that's very interesting about the way tan oaks and true oaks die from sudden oak death is they tend to die standing. So in a forest, most trees die when they fall over or they snap off for a variety of different reasons, and so they'll end up on the forest floor. But the tan oaks tend to die while they're still standing, and they'll stay standing for a very long time and then sort of slowly fall apart over time. So one of the concerns is you now have a dead tree that's standing, and that's a potential fire ladder to spread. But I don't know how much we know about the potential impact of those dead tan oak trees and true oak trees for fires in California. Certainly a lot of in the Sierra Nevada, a lot of the trees that have been killed by beetle outbreaks and things like that, that's creating a huge fire risk by the number of trees that have been dying and left standing in those forests.
Do you have anything else you wanted to say?
Sudden oak death is certainly changing the landscape in California in a lot of ways, and it's something that we need to pay attention to. But unfortunately, it's probably not something that we can stop. There aren't easy ways of going in and controlling it on the scale that it is spreading through the landscape. So what we need to do is understand what its impacts are going to be able to respond to those to make sure that we maintain healthy wildlands in those places. But most important, to think about movement of live plant material through horticulture practices or firewood movement through the state or things like that to prevent other kinds of invasive pests and pathogens from spreading around.